Afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. The presentation will begin shortly. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be distributed to registrants and made available publicly within 1 week after the live event. Questions can be submitted at any time throughout the event through the Q&A function on your Zoom toolbar. For technical support questions related to Zoom, visit support.zoom.us. ASL interpreters are available to pin, or you can click the interpretation button on your Zoom toolbar and select ASL to populate the interpreter in a separate window. Closed captioning is also available through the Zoom toolbar, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. Good afternoon. I do believe a few more are still trying to sign in and getting settled, but we're going to get started on time and ask that you just please take a moment to view this disclaimer on the slide. This presentation is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you along with a link to the materials and an evaluation survey within a week. We ask that you not make your own recording or otherwise reproduce this presentation. Please note that the information provided in the presentation is general in nature. You should rely on your institution's appointed vice president liaison and other commission staff members for specific information that is relevant to your institution. So thank you again to all that are out there with us for joining us for today's webinar. Today's webinar is titled Let's Talk Curriculum Maps and Other Evidence for Self-Study. Next slide. My name is Judy Seipel. I'm the Senior Vice President for Accreditation Relations and Services here at the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. And today I'm joined by Jackie Snyder. I'm going to ask Jackie to take a moment to introduce herself.
Sure, thanks, Judy. Delighted to be here. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jackie Snyder. I work for the State University of New York, otherwise known as SUNY. I am the Assistant Provost for Health Professions Education Program. And prior to this position, I worked on SUNY campuses starting in 2009 as several ALO positions on those campuses. I'm delighted to be here with everyone today.
Very good, and thank you, Jackie. Next slide. The learning outcomes for today's webinar are listed on the screen. Today's session is focused on Standard 5, which is Educational Effectiveness Assessment. This standard is all about assessment of student learning, and the expectations for institutions to demonstrate that their students have accomplished their educational goals. We will provide a broad overview of the criteria and the evidence expectations for Standard 5, and then we're going to spend some time discussing curriculum maps, which are an evidence expectation but also play a significant role in driving your assessment plans. You will learn the framework for developing curriculum maps and best practices for implementing them into your assessment process. Next slide. We invite you to submit questions at any time during the session using the Q&A function on your Zoom toolbar. Questions will be addressed at the end of today's webinar. Next slide. Standard 5 is an area that is at the heart of your work, ensuring that students accomplish their educational goals. In order to do that, institutions need to define the goals, assess those goals, and consider those assessments to make meaningful improvements. While it sounds straightforward, many of our institutions are still working to establish and implement an organized and systematic assessment process. Next slide. In fact, when we look at actions resulting from self-studies over the past 5 years, Standard 5 is the top cited standard for institutions that go into noncompliance, and also for institutions that have accreditation reaffirmed, but require some follow-up through a supplemental information report. At the top of the slide, you can also see some overarching statistics for institutions that have gone through self-study. Of the 69 institutions that went through self-study in fiscal year 24, 87% of them had accreditation reaffirmed or granted, while 13% were found to be out of compliance with one or more standards. 55% of them had no follow-up, and 32% were reaffirmed with follow-up. Next slide. So let's consider those institutions that were reaffirmed with no follow-up. What are they doing to demonstrate compliance with Standard 5? Institutions that have successful assessment processes are able to demonstrate the 5 bullets that you see on the slide. First, they have defined their student learning outcomes, both at the degree or program level and for general education. General education outcomes are also referred to often as institutional level outcomes because they apply to all students regardless of the program. Second, those institutions have established a structure for systematically conducting and documenting assessment of student learning, and you're going to hear that word a lot today, documenting. That structure is well communicated, and it includes clear guidelines for who is conducting the assessments and how those will be done. Once those assessments are completed, they must be communicated and considered for improvements that need to be made. Sometimes those improvements, they're at the course level, and other times they're at the program or the institutional level. When improvements are made, they need to be documented. In some cases, those improvements rise to the level of being linked to the planning or the budgeting process. This isn't always the case, but the assessment process needs to include a mechanism for those linkages when the improvements require it. And finally, the institutions that are doing well with assessment periodically assess their assessment process. They look at learning outcomes, they consider the methods for assessing those outcomes, they discuss where in the student's learning experience assessments are happening, review how those things are being documented, and these are just a few considerations. Next slide. What I just spoke about should be familiar to all of you, as it mirrors the criteria within Standard 5. In addition to the criteria, I will remind everyone that with the updates to the standards that went into effect about 2 years ago, the Commission created an accompanying document titled Evidence Expectations by Standard, which identifies evidence expectations for each criterion within the standards. Next slide. Listed on the slide are just a few of the evidence expectations required for Standard 5. An all-inclusive list can be found in evidence expectations, which is linked to this slide and will be provided to you following this session. Click, please. All of these expectations are important, but today's focus is on curriculum maps due to the critical role that they play in serving as documentation for many of these evidence requirements, and also for the role they play in driving an institution's assessment process. Next slide. So let's talk curriculum maps. As we just discussed in the overview for Standard 5, the Commission is most interested in assessment at the program level. So I'm going to take a minute and ask my colleague Jackie a couple questions to help move us through the presentation. So Jackie, my first question for you is, how do curriculum maps guide assessment at the program level?
So Judy, if we could advance the slide. Thank you. It's really important that we have a level setting idea of exactly how curriculum mapping occurs at the different learning levels that you spoke about. So the foundational parts of learning outcomes assessments are typically broken into 3 areas, and these vary by campus. As you noted, sometimes institutional learning outcomes are called general education outcomes, or perhaps are called objectives. So the purposes of today's discussion, we're going to be referring to these different levels as institutional learning outcomes, program learning outcomes, and course learning outcomes. So this is important to have this understanding. The curriculum mapping occurs at the program level, the PLO level, as the learning outcomes that are the middle of the pyramid, the learning is flowing up and down. These are the best place, this is the best place to have that alignment occur. So you're going up to the institutional level on the curriculum map, and you're going down and drilling into the courses themselves where that learning is taking place. Next slide, please. So here, as part of this continued level setting, we want to really identify where curriculum maps are happening in the assessment process. So we need to understand the process. So we start with identifying program learning outcomes. That's where we're going to also start to develop the curriculum map and list how the students will be assessed through multiple measures, indirect, indirect. And then we're going to gather that assessment data, and the faculty use that information and results to improve the program. Again, this is a refresher. We're identifying actions coming out of those assessments based on the results to maintain or enhance student learning and create a follow-up plan if needed to assess the impact of the actions. What is important to note is that at this point in the life of assessment, we're talking decades now of expected assessment at the student learning levels, is that there should be mature assessment cycles happening on campuses. So that means that each PLO is assessed at least twice over the institution's multi-year assessment cycle. And it's important to note that program faculty lead this assessment process, and assessment results are used to improve teaching and learning and resource decisions, as Judy mentioned, in some cases, budgetary decisions. And finally, document all of this planning, all of the discussions that take place around this cycle need to be documented. We'll talk more about that. The other thing that I think we all need to be mindful of is that assessment is not a lot of things, and sometimes it gets labeled this, but it isn't. It is not busy work. It is not entering information into a system, but doing nothing with it. It is not the total standardization of the curriculum. This could be helpful in some cases, but it's not just that. And it's not assessing when it's convenient. So there are some challenges the institutions may face. If we could advance the slide, please. So some of the challenges means taking a deeper dive at some of these reoccurring things that tend to bubble up as you're thinking about your assessment process on your campus. So as you're coming up with your system, you want one that's going to allow for creativity and flexibility without having assessment be completely ad hoc, not just a once in a while type of activity. Being facilitate appropriate connections between program learning outcomes and how they are fulfilled by other departments. So for perhaps part of the learning outcomes includes faculty from general education areas. Another challenge is being able to assess student learning and draw conclusions at all levels, including the institutional level or that gen ed outcome level, while being able to make meaningful change more centrally within the program itself. Developing a common language for discussing the results. That's part of your assessment culture. That language really is unique from institution to institution. So it's not only developing it, it's also understanding it, that people on campus understand the language. It's keeping track of all the discussions and changes and actions that are being made to the curriculum that perhaps might be a conversation. It might be a department meeting. It might be just a lunch conversation, but having that documented is extremely important. Communicating the results is a challenge, and who do we communicate those results to? Who is interested? Who needs to know? The administration, the deans, are there advisory boards that are interested in the program learning outcomes assessment? Balancing the need for program outcomes assessment, so the program review and the assessment of student learning without conflating the two. Having a good balance. And then devising a process which provides for regular assessment, but which is not so burdensome that it becomes unsustainable. So it really needs to be reasonable. How do you keep it in a very focused area so that it's not too much work, but not ad hoc? That's a huge challenge. Next slide, please. So why a curriculum map? Well, this is an extremely important document because it serves not only as a piece of evidence in your self-study, but it serves as a visual tool to show the relationship between the academic program's student learning outcomes and the courses or the experiences that they have while part of that program. It demonstrates progression of student learning in the academic program. It identifies gaps that may occur in the curriculum. It can be used as a planning tool to identify which courses provide the best evidence of students' development or achievement of student learning outcomes. It helps to communicate expectations to students by using it, again, as a visual tool to show students exactly how they will progress through the curriculum. It promotes discussion among faculty and administration, advisory groups. And then your accrediting body can use a curriculum map to assure all required learning outcomes are being taught and at what level they are being taught and how they are assessed. These help to meet that requirement. A curriculum map is that evidence. Next slide. A curriculum map really is the assessment plan for program learning outcomes assessment. It shows where the PLOs are assessed. It identifies the tools that are going to be used to complete that assessment. It shows which courses that will be deemed as the point of assessment collection. And then it also has a rotation that allows for the cycle of assessment.
All right, Jackie, thank you for that introduction to curriculum maps. When we registered attendees, we invited you to post questions that you would like to be answered today. And when registering, many of our attendees today asked about strategies to get faculty involved with the creation and implementation of curriculum maps. So we do want to spend a little bit of time discussing this. Jackie, what tips do you have for our audience today in getting faculty involved?
Thanks, Judy. Well, faculty are the core of completing this activity. They are the most informed about the curriculum. They are the individuals who are ensuring that the learning outcomes are taking place. So it is imperative to have qualified and knowledgeable faculty involved in the linking of the levels of these maps, right? The CLOs to the PLOs to the ILOs. It's also important to have collaboration. Next slide, yes, please. Thank you. It's also important to have collaboration among different constituents on your campus. So you have the program faculty that are have the knowledge of the curriculum. They understand the learning outcomes. They are face to face with the students in the teaching and learning environment. However, but there are other folks on campus who also would help in informing the development of a curriculum map. And that might be an assessment leader. That might be a dean of a college. It really will depend on the size of your institution. If you're a large institution and you have a school of humanities or a school of business, that is going to be a totally different type of collaboration in comparison to perhaps a small community college that only has one person, one faculty member dedicated to a program. And in that case, you want to have faculty who are from similar disciplines who can come together and have discussions about the learning outcomes and of their program, and discussion about, this is what I think I'm going to use as the assessment tool, and this is how I think my PLO aligns to the ILO. So it's getting that collaboration and feedback from your peers, even if they're not in the exact same program. Small institutions have always been very good at being nimble and pulling the players together that need to be part of those conversations. But there is a distinct difference between a large institution completing a curriculum map activity or initiative versus a small institution. So you're leaning into the experts on your campus. Faculty are responsible. They know the content. They're very good at understanding that interconnectedness between course learning outcomes and PLOs and ILOs. But there may be some other folks on campus too that are able to assist. Next slide, please. So here are a few thoughts to consider as you're beginning the curriculum mapping process. What courses to include? So generally, it's best to start out simple and only include the required courses in your program. Once those are set, then program elective courses can be reviewed, and then you can branch into other support courses, such as perhaps you have a general education requirement that's related to humanities or the arts, but if you're in a business program, you don't necessarily have a PLO that would align with the arts. But that course is needed for graduation. So perhaps those faculty come in and you talk about the learning outcomes that are taking place in their courses during that collaboration period, excuse me, that we just spoke about. So remember that not all students take the same electives and the same set of general education courses. So you cannot assume that the same level of student learning outcome coverage is happening as it is happening in the required courses. So again, that's part of that conversation and learning from other faculty teaching students within the program. You may have a single course that's taught by multiple instructors. This requires coordination among instructors who teach the course. It also requires some standardization as to what is covered and what assessments are used, especially if the course is used for a program assessment data collection point. So bringing all the instructors together for a conversation about which PLOs the course supports and how best to assess learning is important. Emphasize that the course is part of the program's curriculum. And so when you have a good group, a full group of faculty, you have to have some consensus, especially for assessing program learning outcomes. The other thought to consider at the beginning is, does the curriculum drive the assessment, or is it the reverse? When I assess student learning, what is the best evidence of their development and achievement of program learning outcomes? These are questions to ask yourself. How do I assess student learning, and what are the criteria for success? How do you know they did it? What's that benchmark? The curriculum should drive the assessment. However, the PLOs should shape the curriculum. The overriding objectives need to be considered first, right? These overriding learning outcomes. This concept may be foreign to some programs that have allowed the curriculum to be shaped by short-lived trends, or perhaps there were specialties or interests of individual faculty members who bring that to the program. A good curriculum should be planned and designed, not merely something that randomly evolves over time. When you're analyzing your curriculum with a map, be sure to keep the PLOs, not the courses, central to the conversation. And then who else? We've talked about this a couple of times. Who are the other groups that should be involved? This is typically the case with support courses like general education, but it's best to begin with the required courses that the program controls, have that conversation first. And then once the assessment is in place, then the program can conduct more of a global scale of the courses taught outside of the core courses in the program to determine if the courses map to the PLOs. And I believe that is all I have. Sample curriculum maps. Judy. Oh, I think you're muted.
At this point, thanks, Jackie. At this point in the program, Jackie's going to take some time to walk you through some sample curriculum maps and talk about the best practices for implementing those. So Jackie, I'm turning it back to you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. We can go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is small, and my apologies, but we will drill into the sections at the top. So this is a blank curriculum map. It is a simple table that is built in a Word document, columns and rows. And what you're really focusing on is the top part. And curriculum maps can be set up in different ways. This is a basic one. It should show information about your PLOs. You should have a row for your ILOs, or an area, or some sort of crosswalk intersection of the ILOs to the PLOs. This is also a place in the third row there to identify the assessment tools. And then finally, the courses in that very first column would be listed down the left side. This is a curriculum map that I created in 2010 and is a basis for all curriculum mapping activities as you're starting on a campus. And it worked extremely well, especially with a short amount of time to accomplish a follow-up report. We needed to have evidence of where the learning was taking place. And this became like I said, the base, the foundation of a curriculum map. There are many other versions, but for today, this is the one that we will be taking a closer look at. Our next slide, please. Okay, so up at the top, you have your program learning outcomes. So graduates from this program will be able to, what do you want them to be able to do as they're going across the stage? Remember, we've already talked about, you've reviewed those, you've taken a look at them. And this is now where you're going to identify each one individually in the boxes moving across. So a simple table really works well with the rows and to set that up. Then your ILOs would be the next row down, and the assessment tools, which we'll drill into those in just a second. So let's go to the next slide, please. So reviewing the PLOs, as I said, that really is the first step to make sure that your PLOs are stated the way you want them to be stated. So do the program learning outcomes accurately reflect the program and the department's goals for the program? Do the program learning outcomes focus on what students should be able to know, do, and value by the end of the program? Are the levels stated from the student's perspective? What students will be able to know or do by the end of the program? Are the program learning outcomes measurable? Can we assess them? Can course artifacts provide a good assessment of the skill? And if not, how will you measure the student learning? Let's take a look at the next row. Next slide, please. So this is the row where the ILOs are aligning to the PLOs. So thinking back to that pyramid at the beginning of this presentation, and the ILOs, or the general education outcomes that they are also referred to, this is the section at the very top. The smallest number of learning outcomes are in your ILOs. It's usually a handful. And the curriculum map demonstrates how those PLOs meet the ILOs. So what do you need to start this documentation of that process? Well, you need a list. You need a list of your ILOs. And if you assign a letter or a number to each of those ILOs, and then in the box that's underneath the individual column of the PLO, you place that reference, a 1, a 2, an A, a B, however you define it. And there can be more than one ILO in a box. And not all ILOs may meet the program curriculum. Some ILOs may be met through co-curricular learning that takes place outside of the classroom. And that's not on this curriculum map. But remember, if that is occurring, it must be assessed. If, for example, you have students who are required for your institutional learning outcomes or your gen ed outcomes to be involved in community service, or perhaps they need to, be able to participate in a job shadowing activity. Some of that may be crosswalked, but some of it may not. Some of it may live in a department that is totally outside of the academic program. So let me show you what this might look like. Next slide, please. So the completed first 2 rows of a curriculum map, and here we're using a business program as an example. So you have your program learning outcomes across the top. You'll notice that you're looking for an action verb, and I always highly recommend Bloom's verbs. They are a great place to start the conversation. What is important about the verb in a PLO is that it tells you how you're going to assess. So for example, analyze data to verify accuracy of conclusions. So where is that analysis taking place? That's where your assessment is going to take place, in that course. So review your statements. The ILO reference, you'll notice that there are 5 ILOs that have been, obviously the ILOs are gen ed outcomes are statements, they're sentences, right? But here they've been reduced down to the core of what that institutional learning outcome or general education outcome reference actually is. So we have communication, critical thinking, quantitative reasoning, diverse perspectives, and information management. And then moving across, you see that in the very first PLO, that very first column to the right, there are 4 ILOs that align to that PLO. And then as you continue through the curriculum, you'll see that it gets smaller, that there are just 2. This is just an example. You may have some that have 3. You may have some PLOs that hit all 5. You just want to make sure that you are reviewing the PLOs for the language and then the alignment to the ILO. And with that, let's talk about assessment measures. So as mentioned, there are 2 different types of assessment measures: direct measures of student learning and indirect. So I want to start off with something that I think has been an ongoing point about student learning assessment. Many times, and early on, when assessment was really being developed and focused upon on all campuses several decades ago, it was noted that final grades are not directly assessing student learning. They just don't. While grades can serve as a summative assessment of learning, they are not a perfect reflection of a student's overall learning journey. They represent a snapshot of a student's performance across a course. often encompassing various aspects like attendance, our participation within the course, and homework completion, in addition to tests and exams. So they are not a direct measure, and they should not be used as measures of the assessment of PLOs. What we want to use is direct evidence of student learning, because we want to see the learning as tangible, visible, and measurable. And that tends to be more compelling evidence of exactly what students have and have not learned. This is because you can directly look at a student's work or performances to determine what they've learned. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Next slide, please. So a sample of some direct assessment tools. So many of these we're all familiar with. And what's important to note is that you would want to identify, perhaps even drilling a little bit further into an exam, for example. So if there was a learning outcome that was really focused on a particular element of that program, and it is in the measurement for that could be the final exam, but it's not the entire final exam. Perhaps it's questions 5, 35, 27, and 2. Then you would take the information from those particular items, those 4 questions, to assess the program learning outcome. It's not the entire exam. But these are just some examples: pre-test, post-test, a paper, it's project, things that you can tangibly see that the student has completed. And that is what a direct assessment is. Let's talk about some indirect measures. Next slide, please. Thank you. So indirect evidence shows that students probably are learning, that what they report to have learned, but it's not as compelling as a faculty member actually looking at students' work. So the issue is, it's not uncommon for a student to self-report either an inflated perspective or they tend to undervalue what that learning was and what they have actually learned. So indirect measures are obviously part of the tools for assessment. However, direct assessment is what you should be capturing and what you should be documenting. You can use indirect measures if you use a direct measure first. So there's a clear distinction. Let's take a look at some examples of indirect assessments on the next slide, please. And these include, as I said, surveys, job placement, questionnaires, focus groups, or interviews. Like I said, what we need to just be mindful of, and what you need to be mindful of in the map, is identifying direct measures and an indirect measure, or 2 direct measures, because we're looking for multiple measures. But there should not be 2 indirect measures, and there should not be final grades. All right, let's go to one last item, the curriculum map scale, before we look at a final. So in curriculum mapping, there are levels that indicate the extent to which a learning outcome is addressed in a particular course or program. And in this case, for this map, we're going to use introduced, reinforced, and mastered. So introduced signifies the initial presentation of a concept or skill or learning, while the reinforced indicates further development and practice of that concept or skill. And mastered suggests proficiency in applying the knowledge and skill. So this is a very common set of 3 letters that show the progression of the curriculum. It is suggested. The goal is to have a scale that shows progress of learning. That's the goal. So if you have other assessment vocabulary that you use on campus, that's perfectly fine, as long as the language shows progression. So let's take a look at the next slide, please. So you saw this slide a few minutes ago as an example of how to add ILO references. The next step include identifying assessment measures for each PLO and assigning a scale to courses that serve the PLOs. Next slide, please. Okay, again, apologies for being a little tiny, but here we have the assessment tools that are listed. So again, you have your ILOs and your PLOs above this row, which we already took a look at, and now we're drilling into the assessment tools and the courses. So this map is designed to detail where evidence of the outcomes can be gathered, right? Where are the measures? And we just spoke about those, the direct and indirect measures. Multiple measures, more than one, is ideal, but direct measures should be used as one or both. Indirect, again, should only be used as one of the two measures. You'll also see that the scale is entered in the column going down. So we're looking at vertical alignment. And in those columns, so if we go to assessment tools over to the right, research paper project, that's the assessment tool for this particular PLO. And you'll see that it is being introduced in ENG 101, a basic English composition course, because this is the written communication program learning outcome. And then it's being reinforced further through the curriculum in COM 200, in Business 200, Business 350, and then ultimately assessed through a research paper project in BUS 499 in the mastery. So this is a 4-year program, bachelor program. So faculty should look for vertical alignment, exactly what is happening in that first column: introduced, reinforced in a few courses, mastered in the end. Can you have 2 letters in one course? You may, absolutely. There's perfectly fine to have something that's introduced and reinforced throughout the course, or reinforced and mastered on the other end. It's not usual to see an IRM all in one course, an introduced, a reinforced, and mastery. That would indicate that the curriculum probably is not, that program learning outcome is not being distributed across several courses. And that's the goal. You want the progression of learning to happen over time, not just popped into a course as introduced, reinforced, and mastered. So you want to look for that proper sequence, an I, an R, and an M as you're moving down the column. So this shows how the information presented to students is building upon the prior knowledge gained in the previous course. As a result, you get to the mastery at the end of the program, and the student will have experienced the teaching and learning needed to meet the PLO of the program. Let's put this all together. Next slide, please. So here we have our completed curriculum map. And important to note, not all the courses are listed on the left side. In this example, it really is the core courses, the main courses of the program. So we have our PLOs at the top. We have crosswalked them to our institutional learning outcomes or general education learning outcomes. We've identified the assessment tools that are going to capture that assessment. An added piece that you could put here would be to identify in which course are those assessment tools taking place. Is it in BUS 499, or is it a couple of classes? Perhaps if it's a research paper, they're starting that in the course prior to, and it's going to be more of a capstone in the final course of the program. So maybe it's a little bit of both, but you can also add in exactly where those assessments are being captured and in what course. So is this the only way to assess a curriculum map or create a curriculum map? No, it's not. Let's take a look at another example. Next slide, please. So in this, as stated, a curriculum map will look different from one user to another, from one university to another. There are multiple designs for a curriculum map, and depending on the information presented, a curriculum map can be very simple or quite complex. If the purpose is to show one set of student learning objectives, a simple two-level graph or crosswalk curriculum map can suffice. So here we're seeing that we have the courses across the top, we have the PLOs down the left, and you have exactly what the electives or selectives are above those courses. So this is flipped from the example that we just looked at. So you have PLOs that are numbered below and then assigned up in the left column there, and then check marks as it goes across. Now, this one is perhaps a pre type of mapping to start that conversation that we talked about. Who needs to be at the table? Who needs to come and have a discussion about the program and the program learning outcomes? Almost being able to identify the collaboration that has to take place in order to get all the courses mapped. Let's take a look at another example. Next slide, please. In this slide, again, we are looking at the programmatic courses that are essential to the program learning outcomes. But here they're using IRM and A. The A is where the assessment takes place. That's another way in which you can identify and clearly indicate where the assessment of the PLO is taking place. Again, very simple, not the entire program, obviously, but for the PLO and the core courses that are aligned to that PLO, this does the job. This shows it. One more example. Next slide, please. Here's a curriculum map that really is diving into all of the courses, including freshman English all the way to the core courses of the program. This is a 2-year degree. And so you have the course listed, the title listed, and then across the top of the columns there, you see the number of credits, institutional student learning outcomes that it aligns to. Is it assessed? Is there an assessment in that course to help meet the learning outcomes? In this case, SUNY General Education Outcomes, which ones exactly these courses are aligned to, assessed again after that identifier, and then program student learning outcome. Which course is aligned to the PSLO and is it assessed there as well? So you can be as detailed as you want with a curriculum map. You want to make sure that it's easy to understand. You will have external eyes on it, including students who may want to understand what their progress is and how their learning is going to take place. So, going back to the culture of assessment on your campus, depending where that is, will depend on how large or how detailed your curriculum map becomes. And I have seen on campuses that start out as simple as the one that we just completed and move into much more details, much more information, because you have those conversations and you review the curriculum map and you realize that, hey, you know what, it would be good to know where those gen ed outcomes are taking place, because I think the psychology piece that we require for general education has elements of critical thinking in there that we require for the program. Let's have a conversation with them and find out exactly how it is reinforcing those concepts. And that's what happens. The curriculum map begins to grow because you're capturing and documenting that evidence. Okay, that is the last example, I believe. There we go.
Very good. Well, thank you, Jackie. I think those examples have really helped our attendees, especially, and we appreciate that you've provided different models, some that are more simple, some that are more manageable for small institutions versus large institutions who might be working with software programs. There are some questions that have popped up around that, which we will get to around at the end of the session. But before we get to that, I think it's important to also reinforce from the Commission's standpoint, Curriculum maps, they serve as an evidence expectation for Standard 5, but we don't tell you how to do it. We don't prescribe a certain model. We don't prescribe exactly how they have to be, what they have to look like, how they have to be managed. We just need to have them. So Jackie's examples, I think, will be able to provide a lot of different options for our attendees, and we thank you for that. But before we get to the end, I think it's really important. We have another question for Jackie regarding curriculum maps. When they are well designed and they're communicated well, what role do they play in the assessment process? Because it's not enough to just have them. They have to be used. So talk to us about why this is so important.
Thanks, Judy. If we could go to the next slide, please. So curriculum maps are the tool that determines how and where learning outcomes are introduced, reinforced, and mastered. That is extremely important. Once you have identified that, you're able to really identify and develop an assessment plan. So the maps ensure all learning outcomes are linked to a course or a series of courses. It identifies the assessment methods used to measure those learning outcomes, and it guides the program assessment plan. It is the program and can be the program assessment plan. So let's take a minute to see what that would look like. Next slide, please. So while not attached or within the curriculum map itself, this certainly could be an added page to your curriculum map. So using, again, a simple table, a program assessment plan is very easy to document through a simple crosswalk. This table shows academic years across the top and PLOs down the left side, and a simple X or a check mark indicates which PLO is assessed in which academic year. It also identifies when the program review is taking place for this program. Remember, you're on a cycle, 5, 6, 7-year cycle to take a look at your academic program review, complete a mini self-study of your program review. So there are a few criteria you should look to see in an assessment plan. So is the program review year identified? So in this plan, we have it at the end, and there should be no PLO assessment taking place in that year. It is intensive. You are pulling a lot of documents together. You are having conversations. You might be including advisory boards. It is really important to focus on that. So it's not recommended to have PLOs being captured and gathered. And you're also having a conversation about your PLOs during the program review process. So you want to have that all done before you have that conversation. The other criteria you want to look for is there mature assessment happening? Remember, mature assessment is 2 or more assessment cycles. So here we have PLO 1, for example, taking place in 24-25 and 27-28. If we go to PLO 2, we have 2025-26 and then 27-28, but there's only a year in between. As long as it makes sense for the program, it doesn't have to be a PLO every year. It doesn't have to be a PLO every other year. It works with what makes sense for the campus, especially if you're in a small institution where perhaps there is such a finite rotation of courses that if you want to capture the assessment in that mastery course or proficient course, that last level, it may not come up in 25-26. Maybe it's going to be offered in 26-27 because you're cohort based. So you want to be mindful of mature assessment, a couple of cycles within the time frame of one program review to the other, and it needs to be reasonable and in line with your course scheduling. And reasonable, again, is so important. It should, I can't stress that enough. You want to have a plan that is agreed upon by your faculty and your administration to make sure that, you know, everything is in line. And it can be done, because nothing's more frustrating to come up with a plan and then you can't implement what you thought you were going to be able to do. So we have the map, and now we have the assessment plan. What next? Now what?
All right. So to recap, let's just talk about, we have walked through several different steps to help institutions understand the curriculum mapping process. We've discussed the importance of faculty involvement in this process and discussed some of those strategies to make that happen. We've also discussed ideas on how best to use curriculum maps. So now that we've completed those steps, what strategies can you share on how best to implement those curriculum maps to drive assessment? Because that's the purpose, right? To help serve as a tool to implement your assessment plan.
Thanks, Judy. So the first thing that you want to do, if we can go to the next slide, is really assess the curriculum map itself as part of the process. How to use it is making sure that it's complete. Do we have everything aligned that needs to be aligned? Are all the courses in the program's curriculum on that map? Are there any gaps, important program learning goals that are addressed by too few courses or not enough or too many courses? Are there redundancies, excessive coverage of a less important skill? Too many I's and R's for a particular learning outcome? Are important learning goals addressed only in electives? If that's the case, we talked about it. Students travel through programs on their own path, and some of those electives may not be taken by the students. So really important to make sure that if you are utilizing electives as part of the learning, that they are not an M course. They cannot be an M course. Is the curriculum distributed? Do we have that vertical alignment going down in a distributed fashion? Any single course trying to address too many of the program learning outcomes? Any single course is addressing a goal on too many levels, the I, the R, and the M, remember? We talked about that. Do any key courses fail to address at least one outcome? Do we have, in the business program example, do we have a business course that we're requiring that really is not aligned with any PLO of the program? And then, is the curriculum accessible? Can we assess in the curriculum that we've identified? It's almost a checklist to go through. So you have your curriculum map. We want to use the curriculum map. We need to make sure that the curriculum map has the information needed in order to make that happen. Let's go to the next. So reviewing and planning. So when we have a curriculum map, it's extremely important for faculty to review the aggregate outcomes institutionally to discover any trends or issues of concerns. So you want to do this on a fairly routine annual basis. And a lot of campuses will dedicate time for those conversations to take place. Again, as we talked about early on, curriculum mapping, the faculty are paramount to the knowledge of what is happening in the program. But there needs to be time to review those outcomes and create action plans to meet trends or deficiencies, or change the curriculum in some way. So really having dedicated time to have that review take place. Disaggregating the data for any emerging trends in order to discover, where these changes may be made to improve the teaching and learning. If we have, going back to the example just stated, if we had a business course that was not aligned to any of the PLOs in the program, what changes do we need to do to the curriculum to either infuse that course and do a drill into the course learning outcomes and see why we don't think that's happening for this course. The other way you can disaggregate the data is to look at student subpopulations. So all of us have so many different types of students in our classrooms now. We're seeing an uptick in some adult learners coming into our SUNY classrooms. And we have P-TECH students or dual enrollment or early college students who are learning differently. Of course, the bulk of the traditional age student remains the largest population. But by disaggregating out those populations, we might be able to discover things that are hurdles or challenges for those particular populations. So for example, if you have an adult population that's coming back into a business program and you're seeing more and more students in that category, but they're falling short in the quantitative reasoning or a mathematical program learning outcome, perhaps there needs to be some sort of supports put in place before the students reach that math course so that they can meet the program learning outcomes assessment. So disaggregating the data is becoming more and more important to truly help students navigate all of the learning within that program. You want to plan for changes. Be mindful that if you, same example, perhaps we have to infuse some in-class tutoring or some math lab time into the curriculum. So how do we do that? And who needs to be at that table? So plan for those changes. Address any necessary budget implications for planned improvements. Perhaps there is a dedicated business lab that's needed for the students to really understand and learn what it's like to work in the world of business, in particular, maybe the stock market or international business or, other categories. So address that would come through the budget resource allocation requests. And these assessments will help build the foundation for those types of budget requests. You want to review your curriculum maps regularly and tweak as needed, right? So a lot of times curriculum, it takes a shared governance process, develops out of the faculty, oftentimes goes to a curriculum committee, perhaps a senate or a faculty council of some sort, and then through the administration channels. So that takes time. That's not done overnight. It's not a decision that is created, developed, and done by the next semester. Sometimes that takes multiple semesters to do. But that is why the review of the curriculum maps becomes so important. And then document everything. Every decision that you make is going to identify and provide evidence for you as you are talking about assessment at the program learning outcomes level. Having those conversations, having PLO assessment on your department agenda so that, people have an opportunity to talk about it, and then it's in the minutes. Minutes are so important for evidence. So document everything, every action, every decision, so that you can show the process of assessing the assessment plan on the curriculum map and assessing the curriculum map itself. With that, we are ready to recap the next steps, and then we'll probably be ready for some questions after that. So get the right people in the room, have the people across the campus that need to be part of that conversation. You want to start with your program faculty first, and then develop who else needs to be invited to curriculum mapping. Provide time and support. Administrators need to provide common planning time, provide time and support for these folks to come together and start that process. Keep it simple. Create a simple table to capture the information. You want to make sure that you're crosswalking your PLOs to your ILOs or gen ed outcomes. That's extremely important. How does your program meet those institutional learning outcomes and support the ILOs? Identify your assessment measures, identify where they're taking place, list them, drill in, and add exactly where they're taking place. if that's helpful for your faculty. Decide on the courses that are going to be IRMs, introduced, reinforced, or mastered. Have discussions about that, and perhaps thinking too that it might not be, again, in the business program example, it might be that English comp course that's the very first introduction to written communication as it relates to that programmatic PLO. Develop an assessment plan that's reasonable. Do not assess every PLO every year. That's not reasonable. Spread it out. You have time. Make sure that you're not assessing a PLO during a program review year, but do make sure that it's mature. Do make sure that it is at least 2 cycles of that PLO between program reviews. And then remember, it's not over when you do it. You're always changing the curriculum. It's not once and done. There are things that change in industry that drive your curriculum that are going to change courses and learning outcomes. So remember that this is a process that will continue, and you'll be able to show your assessment of this process by keeping your earlier versions of the curriculum maps as evidence as you're preparing for the large self-study, the middle state self-study. With that, I believe I have covered everything, but I am looking forward to questions. Judy?
We have just a few more slides before we get to questions. Upcoming events, next slide, please. This is just a friendly reminder that our conference seems like it's so far away, but December will be here before we know it. The annual conference is scheduled for December 10th through the 12th and will be held in Philadelphia. It's another great opportunity to learn about best practices in assessment and other critical accreditation activities from our member institutions. Registration opens in August, so please keep your eyes out for that and join us in December. And with that, we'll go to the next slide. A reminder that at this time you may submit questions if you haven't already done so. We do have a lot of questions. We'll see how many we can get through today. But if you have questions, please do submit them through the Q&A function on your Zoom toolbar. All right, Jackie, I am going to start with a question for you.
Sure.
And that question is, can you talk more about what it means to have each PLO assessed at least twice over the cycle? This is something you talked about early in the session. And also, how long should a cycle be?
Okay, so at the programmatic level, you have, you want to take a look at your program itself overall, typically within a 5, 6, 7-year cycle. In New York State, for state universities, they are required to take a look at their programs and complete this program review, which includes a deep dive into what is the admissions process for this program? What types of student support systems do we have in place? What are the KPIs? How are the graduation rates? How are the retention rates? What students, how fast are we graduating students? Do we have students who are here longer than a 4-year program? Is it taking them 5 or 6 years? So that's what a program review is. You're really taking a deep dive into the program, and that should be done on a routine basis that fits with the campus. Annually, not reasonable. Perhaps, an annual summary of a reaction to KPIs, but a deep dive that really takes a look at what students are learning, what policies do we have in place, what guidelines or requirements do we have within the program. That should happen on a 5 to 6, 7-year schedule. The mature assessment means that you have completed 2 cycles of an assessment of a program learning outcome. So if you have the program learning outcome about written communication, that you're assessing it once, and those results you have identified, analyzed, and come up with an action plan on how to make some changes. Perhaps they're operational changes. Perhaps it needs to be later in the curriculum. Perhaps it shouldn't be the first semester. Maybe let's try it and let's move it to the second semester. And then taking the action and then assessing that PLO again to see if there was improvement or any changes, or if it was worse for students. Did the student learning not improve as we envisioned it would? And then making an adjustment again to then assess it the second time. So it's two full cycles of that assessment within the time period between program review to program review. So within the 5 or 6 or 7 years in which you're taking that deep dive into the program.
All right, Jackie, another question. Do you recommend having a common template for a curriculum map at large schools and those with many programs?
So I think what is easiest for a campus is to have a common tool, because then it's easy to read and navigate. You have to remember who you're sharing the curriculum map with, right? So I understand that accredited, especially health programs, have their accreditors curriculum map guidelines. And other, business accreditors, they have their own. And I'm not saying you need to not use those or you need to change them. But there should be, for the programs that don't have a required curriculum map, there should be a common curriculum map so that it's easy for people across the campus to understand what it is. Perhaps an advisor is going to share it with a student. It would be really confusing for that student to, take a look at 3 different curriculum maps that are, you have to understand each one. So to have a template that's common for those programs that are not third-party accredited, I think that is extremely important. It just keeps the conversation and the visual common. So that, even if you're having a conversation with a dean or a colleague, and you're talking about your alignment of PLOs to ILOs, everybody can visualize where that is in the curriculum map. Whereas if you don't have a common template, it would be really hard to visualize what that looks like. So yes, I do recommend a common template.
All right, Jackie, going back to the question that you answered previously about the cycle of assessment, the question is, isn't it preferable to have the assessments coincide with the program review cycle?
So the program review cycle, you should be taking a look at the results of the PLOs. So if you follow the two cycles of assessment in between, you have those 2 years of results to respond to in your program review. So there could be other assessments of the program, such as an alumni survey. There could be other assessment things that happen during that year of the program review that is outside of the direct measures of student learning at the program level. So the goal is to have all of the PLOs assessed twice in between those program review times, so that when you have your little self-study of your program, you're able to have a conversation with those folks who are completing the review, or any outside advisors that may be coming to give you some feedback on your program review. That allows them to really take a look at all the PLOs, all the assessments that have happened, what actions were taken, were there any improvements or changes that showed improvement, and then what are the next steps. So you really want to assess that learning prior to the self-study process. I hope that helps with the clarity.
All right. We have a question. Thank you, Jackie. We have a question that I'll go ahead and answer, specific to our standards. In Standard 5, are we examining assessment of credit programs, or should we also be examining assessments for non-credit or workforce development programs? Please define programs. Standard 5 is specific to credit-based programs because we're asking you to conduct educational effectiveness assessment at the degree or the program level. However, You still need to assess non-credit and workforce development programs, and that would fall under Standard 3, the final criterion, which asks that all student learning experiences be assessed. So I hope that that helps to clear that piece up. We have another question, Jackie. Must all PLOs in a specific program map to an ILO?
No, very good question. You want to make sure that within the program itself, the student is having the experience to be exposed to the learning that addresses the institutional learning outcome. So if you have 5 ILOs or general education outcomes, you should see that taking place in the PLOs across that row. But there could be one that doesn't hit an institutional learning outcome. It could be something that is just unique to the program and not to the institution itself. That being said, you want to make sure that all 5 of the ILOs are addressed somewhere in those PLOs, which is why you can have more than one ILO mapped to a single PLO. But no, there's not a requirement. There would not be, it would be okay to have a PLO that did not have alignment to an ILO.
All right, Jackie, another question. Who is responsible to set ILOs?
So I can share that typically comes from a committee of some sort on your campus. I have been on campuses where they have put ad hoc groups together to identify what those institutional learning outcomes should be, what those statements should be. And typically it is a cross section of folks from across the campus, including faculty, administrators, directors, and it goes through the shared governance process. Once you identify them, you share them out and receive feedback, or you can do a town hall or a forum to get some additional feedback on them, and then an approval process going through your shared governance process is the best way, I think, to establish institutional learning outcomes. I've seen it work in that process, that model work very well at institutions. I think the follow-up to that is a question that often comes up. So once you have them and you need to assess them, and you've gone through a couple of cycles, who's responsible for changing them or updating them? And that tends to be more of a challenging question because sometimes assessment sits in different parts of an organizational chart on a campus. And so, the challenge then becomes, well, is it the assessment committee's responsibility to develop or redevelop the ILOs, or do we pull everybody together again and have, that really long process? Or is it just, do we really just need to look at 1 or 2? It should be a collaborative effort. It should include stakeholders across the campus. Important to include students in that conversation as well. And then they're developed, and they should have a shelf life of several years unless something is changing on your campus. So it's not something that has to be done annually. Your ILO should be set for a while. That's a great question.
All right, Jackie, the questions keep coming. Should
Okay.
concentrations within a major have different curriculum maps? Should concentrations have different PLOs?
Interesting. So a concentration definitely can be put and placed into a curriculum map. I think it's a good thing, especially for students, again, to have that visual, going back to keeping it simple. And as you start to curriculum map and go through the process, they become more complex. And so, yes, I think having a concentration definitely should yield that representation within the curriculum map itself. And what was the second part of that, Judy? I'm sorry.
The second part of that,
Should they
I'm
have?
sorry, I moved it into an answered section. I'm going to find it in just a second.
Sure.
Should concentrations have different PLOs?
Should they have different PLOs? Thank you. So the PLOs, I think what you're going to see is that a concentration will have more PLOs. I think if it's a business, for example, so a business administration with a concentration in international business, you're going to have your business administration PLOs, and then you're going to have perhaps 2 or 3 international business focused PLOs. So your map just becomes a little bit larger because there are specific things within that concentration that students are learning outside of a student who's taking the base of a business administration type of degree. So you would have an additional PLOs.
Okay. Another question. Is it recommended to have students evaluate each assignment they have for formative assessment, or to rely on the end of course evaluations for the course level summative assessment?
So course evaluations, they are really taking a look at the learning and responding to some things that are, for example, the management of the class itself. I don't see course evaluations as part of the program learning outcome direct measures. I see them perhaps as more of an evaluation of pedagogy, or that is the hybrid model, or the course it's of the textbook. I don't see the course evaluations as measuring PLOs. I have not come across that, I would say, since 2009 as a course evaluation as a tool for measuring PLOs. I think it becomes more of an assessment that's used in the promotion and tenure process for faculty versus the assessment of student learning at the program level.
All right, another question. Can you please help by explaining a bit more about how there can be too many I and R marks introduced and reinforced? I'm not sure I understand how it's possible to expose a student to a critical learning outcome too many times.
Oh, good question. So I think it was, you really want to have it balanced. So what you want to do is, sure, you should have I and R's and very few M's, you would imagine. But you just want to make sure that the I's and the R's, and this is where you drill into the course learning outcomes to really take a good look at those. Again, going back to the core courses of the program, the core business classes that are meeting that PLO should all be identified with an I, an R, and an M. That's the goal. They're in the curriculum because they are teaching key principles and knowledge to the student that either introduces, reinforces, or the mastery is occurring for students in the course. So I think what you're looking for is, if you have, we'll say there are 8 core courses in the business class or business program, and you have 1 mastery, and you have 4 introductions and just a couple of reinforcements, it might be a place to have a conversation and say, well, gosh, we're introducing this PLO in 50% of the classes of the core classes for this program. Is there a way maybe we could condense that down to 1 course so that we can give them more reinforcement, or provide an either or mastery type of opportunity for students? So it really is, taking a look at that vertical alignment of the core courses that are meeting the PLOs, and then taking a deep dive to say, could we do this differently? Should we do it differently? What are the assessments telling us? So it's a good place to start that conversation if you're seeing an abundance of one letter over the other.
All right, Jackie, another question and a note of appreciation. Thank you for the examples, especially the SUNY example. How do you achieve a certain degree of uniformity across disciplines?
As it relates to the curriculum mapping, I think by having that common time to really come together and collaborate with the different areas of the college. So for example, if you are doing the curriculum maps in a department, some colleges have a department assessment lead. So the assessment lead is going to share, how to make it look uniform, how to make it, the programs within the business school are going to use the same template, and we're going to pull it all together with the help of an administrator or the assessment director, someone who is, an assessment lead could be a faculty member, or an assessment fellow on a campus. There are so many different models, but the uniformity is really coming from that central place of where assessment is housed, right, within an institution. And so that department, that office is going to share, the best practices. This is what, we would like to see, what we want you to use is this template. And so let's talk through what that looks like. It can be a lot of one-on-one meeting times with people to make sure that it's understood and that they are able to, have a dialogue about it. So it really is communication to have that across all of the campuses and schools or divisions. Having that dialogue and that communication is key to have uniformity.
All right, we can get to just a few more questions. We have 6 minutes left. Jackie, which approach do you recommend for the formulation of program learning outcomes? Should they be developed based on the existing modules and course content already in place, or should they be derived from a needs analysis conducted through market surveys?
Interesting. So program learning outcomes really are, and it depends on the program, right? We've been using business all afternoon. So, in that case, if you have an accredited body, a lot of times your PLOs are identified for you, right? This is what we are expecting students. These are the standards of our ABET accreditation, and this is what we expect students to be able to know and do at the end of the curriculum, and you get to keep your accreditation because the students are doing that, right? So I think when you are creating program learning outcomes for programs that are without that type of standardization about learning, that you're really taking a look at what is industry looking for in graduates coming out of these types of programs. And so again, it is conversations with advisory boards, with people in the industry. If you're at a community college, you have these conversations all the time with your career tech and ed programs. You have advisory boards and you're talking about this is what's happening and this is what's changing. And so you need, you should look at that, building that up in your curriculum now, which then can change the PLO itself. So it's doing the research to find out exactly which learning outcomes are expected in the field that degree would serve. And then it's really identifying outcome statements that are not very narrow in their wording, a little more broad, because you want the student to have some flexibility, and you'll need it in the curriculum for them perhaps to take different electives. And so the statements themselves should be able to address that flexibility that's needed in the learning or that's developed in the curriculum. So yes, doing research, I don't know that a market analysis is the end all be all, but it certainly is a piece of it. It's not just one item or survey or piece of data that should inform and create from which your PLO should be created. It should be a mix of many different things.
All right, and I think we have time for one more question. What is the difference between a program learning outcome and a course learning outcome? And do we need to demonstrate indirect assessment, or is direct assessment sufficient?
Great question. So course learning outcomes, thinking back to the pyramid, it's the biggest part of that pyramid. So course learning outcomes are those statements that end with the beginning of students will be able to, by the end of this course, students will be able to do what? What are they going to know? What are they able to do? And that is this course learning statement itself. So course learning outcome is this is what, by the end of the course, the student should be able to know or do. The program is saying that at the end of the program, the academic program, the student will be able to know or do XYZ. So the course, there are many, many courses that make up the program. So you'll have many learning outcomes that are serving or aligning the program learning outcomes, of which there are a few. There should be a handful. And again, accreditors have a lot of learning outcomes, especially nursing. So it's not fair to say that they're all, you only have a few PLOs. But in general, PLOs tend to be a smaller number because you have the courses that are serving the end of the program. You're completing that coursework. The courses have learning outcomes embedded within them. Those learning outcomes help the student meet the program learning outcomes, but it's through the collection of the courses themselves, not one particular course. It's the bringing the courses, the I, the R, and the M's together to meet the program learning outcomes as stated. I hope that's helpful.
All right. And Jackie, thank you for all of your great insight. I know everybody has appreciated it. There are a ton of notes of appreciation coming in through the question and answer. So we thank you. There are also a lot of questions about whether the recording is going to be sent to attendees. Yes, this recorded session will be sent to all registered attendees. It's typically done within 1 week. So I just want to take this last moment to thank everybody for attending today's session and for all of your good work with the commission. If your question did not get answered, please do feel free to reach out to your Vice President Liaison, who can provide additional assistance. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon.